I know that graduation classes have their minds on things other than speeches. So I've decided to build my brief remarks around two illustrations, which a few of you, not many, will remember. First of all is about a student who was kind of a wise guy. He thought he knew more than his professors. I'm sure none of you felt that way. And he had a freshman physics examination, and the question was, how do you measure the height of a building with a barometer? And on his examination paper said, there's so many ways to do that, I don't know which you want. Well, so the professor gave him a failing grade, and the student appealed to the professor. So the professor called him in and said, okay, you're such a wise guy. What do you mean by there's so many ways? He said, well, that's not the most accurate way to measure the height of a building with a barometer. I know that you can take it to the ground and you can take the atmospheric reading and go to the top of the building and take another atmospheric reading, and you can compute the approximate height. And the professor said, that's right. That's all. And the student said, no, it's not. He said, you can also take the barometer, put it on the ground, measure its height, measure the length of its shadow, measure the length of the shadow of the building, and you can compute the height of the building. He said, that's approximately correct, but there's a better way still. And the professor said, what is it? He said, well, you can take the barometer to the top of the building, take a stopwatch, drop the barometer, measure how long it takes to hit the ground, and you can compute the height of the building. He said, but that's still not the most accurate way. The professor was getting intrigued but also aggravated. He said, well, can you tell me one more way? He said, yes, this is the most accurate of all. Take the barometer to the top of the building, tie a string to it, lower it to the ground, and measure the length of the string. The professor said, well, you're a wise guy, all right? I'm kind of equivocal. About that time, the dean of the college came by, and he was in the business school. So he listened to the argument back and forth, and finally he said, okay, if you tell me something that applies to business, I'll get the professor to give you a good grade. He said, well, that's easy, sir. I'll take this nice barometer to the building superintendent, and I'll say, I'll give you this wonderful barometer if you'll look on the blueprint and tell me how high the building is. Well, the lesson to be learned from this story is that we need always to constantly stretch our minds and also to stretch our hearts, to explore new ideas and not to be bound by custom. That's one illustration. The other one is an account of the most important and the most, I would say, unforgettable interview of my life, which took place exactly 60 years ago in 1951. Admiral Rickover had decided that nuclear power could be used to propel ships. It was a top secret idea. And Rickover and all the Navy was looking for two young officers to head up the planning program and to develop two nuclear power plants, one using liquid water to go in and bring out the heat, and the other one to use liquid sodium to go in and bring out the heat. So every young submariner in the Navy wanted these jobs. So he called me in for an interview. He was sitting in a very luxurious chair behind a big desk, and I was sitting on the straight chair in front of him. All the legs were cut off of the straight chair, and I found out later that the two front legs were cut off 2 inches shorter than the back legs. So I felt like I was sliding off a chair all the time he was interviewing me. So he began to ask me one question after another about current events, and I thought I was very knowledgeable about current events, so I began to give him answers, and every time he asked me questions so advanced that I couldn't answer. And he asked me about literature. What books have you read? And I said, I read all kinds of books, Admiral. He said, well, just give me an example. So I would give him an example. He would ask me question after question until he proved that I didn't know anything about literature. Then he turned to music. He said, Lieutenant, what kind of music do you like? So I like country music, I like classical music. What kind of classical music? I would say, trying to think, opera. What operatic composer is your favorite? And I thought about Wagner. I said, Wagner. What's your favorite one of Wagner's operas? Tristan and Isolde. What's the name of the final movement? I didn't know then it was Liebestodt. So I was in a cold sweat. And finally he asked me a question I thought I could maybe redeem myself. He said, how do you stand in your class at the Naval Academy? And I swelled up with pride. I had done fairly well at the Naval Academy because I finished my second year at Georgia Tech before I went to the Naval Academy. So I said, sir, I stood so-and-so in a class of 865. I didn't make any impression on him. He looked at me. I found out later he stood number one in his class. But then he said, did you do your best? And I thought about the time I was at the academy. Our country was at war, and I spent a lot of time listening to music, reading books. I would go across the other side of the bay, and I would learn how to fly airplanes, and I didn't know what to say. And finally, I looked at him and I said, no, sir, I didn't always do my best. And he stared at me with cold eyes. And finally he said, why not? I sat there for a long time. And then he turned his chair around to end the interview and began to work on some papers on a table behind. And I finally got up and stumbled out of the room. I got the job, probably because I told him the truth. I didn't always do my best. The answer to this question should apply to our personal lives and also to the society in which we live.